So in this morning's reading from Habakkuk, we have essentially it can be confusing unless you know what the reference are. And so the what he described, what the prophet Habakkuk starts out by describing is the rescue of the Israelites from Egypt and God coming into Egypt with plague, and before him went pestilence and plague followed close behind. He stopped and shook the earth, and it talks about his eternal pathways, his ancient pathways shattering mountains and roiling the sea. And so it's really a kind of this poetic description of the Exodus from Egypt, of God's rescue of his people. And what Habakkuk is essentially doing is he's remembering the definitive act of deliverance that God has given to his people. And so after kind of reciting in these very poetic and cosmic terms the rescue of Israel from the land of slavery and from the hand of Pharaoh, then the prophet Habakkuk acknowledges in his prayer that he himself is facing catastrophe. The rottenness enters into my bones, my steps tremble beneath me, I wait quietly for the day of calamity. And in a sense that as he kind of languishes in the midst of his suffering, and talks about the fig trees don't blossom, there's no fruit on the grapevines, there's no produce in the olive trees, and the flocks are dying. And so kind of catastrophe upon catastrophe. And yet he ends it with, and yet I will rejoice in the Lord, I will exult in the God of my salvation. And this is one of the fundamental aspects of following Jesus, even through times of trial and suffering and disappointment, that what we're called to do is remember the decisive act of God in Jesus. And as Jesus in his Gospels, he makes clear through so many different sign acts that he is leading God's people, that Jesus came to lead God's people in a new exodus, in an exodus not from a piece of real estate called Egypt, but from a relationship with death, from our separation from God himself, from the land of sin that holds us slaves to our own brokenness and renders us powerless in the face of our vulnerabilities to how others can hurt us, as well as we hurting them. And that Jesus has come to lead us from that place of slavery, from the grip of death with a capital D, into a new qualitatively more blessed life with his Father through his sacrifice on the cross for us. And in a sense, instead of passing through the waters of the Red Sea, we pass through the waters of death itself with him by joining ourselves with him in baptism by the power of the Spirit. So basically what we can appropriate from the prophet Habakkuk is to remember that in the midst of everything, kind of in the midst of the wheels falling off the wagon of our lives, in the midst of nothing seeming to go our way, I just had a guy, he was doing some work in my garage, and he said that his wife had started crying that he couldn't get to the job because he had to do some work on the house and something in their house broke, and his wife said, why do things have to be so hard for us? And and I think so often we can feel that way. It's just things just get so hard for us that it's beyond our ability to handle. And so in those times, we're called to remember our fundamental deliverance from slavery, and to remember that God loves us and will rescue us from being separated from him, that whatever we're facing isn't something that's beyond God's power, and whatever we're facing is not beyond God's power to redeem. And so we can be joyful even in the midst of suffering, as the prophet Habakkuk says, that he will be joyful even in the midst of suffering. because he can remember. He can remember God's love for his people, and we can remember Jesus's love for us, and that can be a source of strength even when everything else seems to be failing us. A reading from the prophet Habakkuk. A prayer of the prophet Habakkuk according to Shigionoth. O Lord, I have heard of your renown, and I stand in awe, O Lord, of your work. In our own time revive it. In our own time make it known. In wrath may you remember mercy. God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. His glory covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. The brightness was like the sun. Rays came forth from his hand, where his power lay hidden. Before him went pestilence, and plague followed close behind. He stopped and shook the earth. He looked and made the nations tremble. The eternal mountains were shattered. Along his ancient pathways, the everlasting hills sank low. I saw the tents of Cush under affliction. The tent curtains of the land of Midian trembled. Was your wrath against the rivers, O Lord? Or your anger against the rivers? Or your rage against the sea? When you drove your horses, your chariots to victory? You brandished your naked bow, sated were the arrows at your command. You split the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and writhed. A torrent of water swept by. The deep gave forth its voice. The sun raised high its hands. The moon stood still in its exalted place, at the light of your arrows speeding by, at the gleam of your flashing spear. In fury you trod the earth. In anger you trampled the nations. You came forth to save your people, to save your anointed. You crushed the head of the wicked house, laying it bare from foundation to roof. You pierced with your own arrows the head of his warriors, who came like the whirlwind to scatter us, gloating as if ready to devour the poor who were in hiding. You trampled the sea with your horses, churning the mighty waters. I hear and I tremble within. My lips quiver at the sound. Rottenness enters into my bones, and my steps tremble beneath me. I wait quietly for the day of calamity to come upon the people who attack us. Though the fig tree does not blossom, and no fruit is on the vines, though the produce of the olive fails, and the fields yield no food, though the flock is cut off from the fold, and there is no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will exult in the God of my salvation. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.